So they say 1 minute.
Perfect.
Oh. Okay. Okay, so I think the session just started. Yeah. So hi everyone. I hope everyone can hear me and see me. Yes. So this is Nicolas Vallois. This is session 1A of HES virtual conference. This session is about empirical economics, and we'll have 4 presentations today. Each is on a different topic, different geographical zone as well, but I think you'll find links and associations between our articles. So each participant will have 15 minutes for his or her presentation. Then one of us will shortly discuss the paper, and that will leave about 5 or 10 minutes for questions with the audience. So that means we'll start first at 1:30 with Marius Kuster with his paper, When the Diagnosis Spoils the Fun, the weekly reports by the Berlin Institute for Business Cycle Research. Then 30 minutes later, we'll have Lúcia, Regina, Centurião with her article, General Equilibrium Theory and the Search of its Empirical Endorsements, Ludwell Moore. Then 30 minutes later, Bach with Enriching the Concept of Poverty Through Travel. Romesh Chandra Dutt travels to Europe in the late 19th century. And I'll finish with my article, co-author with Sarah Imhoff, the Luftmentsh as an economic metaphor for Jewish poverty, a rhetorical analysis. All right, so I think we can start right now. Marius, it's your turn.
Thank you, Nicolas. So I try to share my screen.
That works.
All right. So thanks a lot, Nicolas, for this introduction. You'll see that the title of my presentation changed quite a bit, but the topic is the same, just the focus shifted a little bit. So the new article is titled Our Compasses Instead of Your Fingertips, and it still deals with the Berlin Institute, but especially with this relation to the private sector. Short outline, I introduced the Berlin Institute, the IFK, the Institute für Konjunkturforschung. I quickly go to my argument, then in the next part explain the diagnosis and the statistical methods by the IFK, and then go on with explaining the new material that came into existence by the interaction between the IFK and the private sector. And finally, I show how the Institute also ventured into this new field of business education. So we are in the Weimar Republic, and in 1924, after the great disorder of inflation and revolution. And right at the stabilization phase, Ernst Wagemann, the economist and statistician Ernst Wagemann, became the head of the statistical office and expanded this office. 1 year later, founded the IFK. The IFK was at the center of a technocratic corporatism, which means that it was an assembly of the German power elite, consisted of delegates from business associations, the Verbände, and ministries, and directly challenged the rather weak Weimar Republic. So the economic expertise that entered into a new relationship with political power. And you see this directly. You see this directly in the Institute's budget. So budget from 1925 until 2032, you see the public sector contributed 50 to 60%. But what is also the case, one line below that, is that businesses also contributed quite a substantial part of the budget. So also like 30 to almost 50% in certain cases. So economic expertise also entered into a new relationship with business. And Wagemann's explicit goal was to change behavior of firms. So I was asking, what did the private sector get in return for its investment in the IFK? And Wagemann promised to the private sector applicable and useful research results. And he explained that in terms of compasses and fingertips. That's why I talk about those two things. And the compasses, his idea was that his compasses, the product of his research, of the IFK's research, would replace the businessman's fingertips in two senses. So in both meanings of the term compass, the diagnosis would be the guidance by the compass, which would be superior to presentiment. And the German term Fingerspitzengefühl, or also my little finger is telling me, is this kind of presentiment. At the same time, you also have statistics. So the precision of the pair of compasses that should replace intuition. So this kind of gut feeling. What it showed is that Wagemann's idea was not really feasible, and the business world could not be convinced of these compasses. And my argument is that only after a certain time and only with quantitative impersonality, Wagemann could finally keep his promise and deliver useful research. And I deal with this in two questions. So why could the business world not be convinced of these compasses in part 3, and then also how the quantitative impersonality could be implemented in practice in part 4. And I base this article on 3 sets of sources, on the publications by the IFK, minutes of the governing board, and the opinion of businesses in journals and internal documents. And the emphasis is really on how this new material, these new publications materialized and was used in practice. So how did the diagnosis work by Wagemann? In 1926, he was relying on the Harvard barometer as the centerpiece of the diagnosis. And he usually compared this stylus chart, which he also called model, to the facts on the right-hand side of the picture. And if you compare the both pictures, so the stylus chart and the factual chart, you could see that there's slight differences between the two. And for example, if you look at the stock market, the dotted curve on the left-hand side, and compare it to the actual curve, you see that the first one remains constant for a longer time than the right one, which rises already early. So this would be a certain kind of interpretation that was left out. And Wagemann said it could be anomaly or also structural change. In the end, he decided it was structural change, which really points to a certain intuition in interpreting these curves. This didn't really change, even though in 1928, he discarded the Harvard barometer and relied on 8 barometers, but often also on 42, what he called important curves. And this diagnosis was then based on the commodity side, so the left picture, and then also compared to the money side on the right-hand side. This, of course, didn't mean that you wouldn't need intuition, because you had to pick the right image or the right curve to interpret, to diagnose. And what also happened is that you could do new combinations with these curves. So for example, this barometer only was used for like a half a year in 1928, and was made up of employment, new orders, and long-term credits. So it was really free to choose which curves to compare. What is also interesting is that even though you have a detailed analysis of these curves, the diagnosis in the end is really unspecific. So for example, in 1928, you would have the diagnosis by Wagemann, who was saying the dangers that could lead to a crisis are not averted. So really not specific at all. In 1927, the IFK still highlighted that statistics should replace intuition, so this Fingerspitzengefühl. And only a couple of years later, they would admit to businessmen that in the end, the diagnosis itself also needs tact and sensitivity. So they really accused the IFK of post hoc rationalization of intuition. So the barometers served only to rationalize feeling for the business cycle, Konjunkturgefühl. What also happened is that the businessmen and lecturers of business education demanded the IFK to concentrate on delivering the facts and omit forecasts entirely. Not only that, but many businessmen also thought that diagnoses were doing more harm than good. So it could very well be that upswing is talked to death with figures. For example, Hermann Bücher, an important industrial, would think that others thought that research could be a danger for the business cycle, and also that the diagnosis could spoil the fun of the upswing. So really this self-fulfilling prophecy that was feared by businessmen. As a consequence, in 1928, the IFK was little more than a source of information for the broadest public. So they really retreated from this diagnosis and forecasting. What was left was the statistical methods, but also they would really be criticized harshly because the main journal, the 90-page quarterly journal, became a 160-page horror for readers not in love with mathematics. And many thought that if simple businessmen could not understand what was given to them, the value is small and the effect is weak. As a result, they demanded statistical material to be already in the processed state. So the response by the IFK was the weekly reports as of April 1928 and up-to-date statistics with simple branch parameters. So you could, for example, compare your own sales and calculate an index, and then compare your sales to the overall branch index. And this was really simple calculations that every businessman could do. Another innovation were business index cards, so small cards that you could, that were printed in the weekly reports with detailed information on specific branches. And those were only printed on one side, so you could cut them out, and then collect them and then use them on a daily basis. A really nice innovation is the handy booklet called Curves and Numbers, Kurven und Zahlen, in 1932 and 1935 with some extensions. And I have it here. I don't know if you can see it on my screen, but it's really a small handy booklet that you could carry around. And the idea was that you look at the weekly report and you see a certain time series with a black dot on the left-hand side. And then you take this series and transfer it to this booklet. So you have it on the left hand, you have tables. You could fill out your time series, and then you would yourself draw the curves on the right side. This one is an example of who was actually used. So it was filled out the tables. The tables were filled out and then drawn by Richard Sieben, an economist who was also working in advertisement. So this is just one example of a good example that the material was actually used. Because this booklet was attached to the weekly reports, which had a circulation of several thousand, it must be that this one is to find in other archives. So I think that this one was really quite widespread. In addition to that, you had connection to the business education centers at universities. So in Berlin, Cologne, Heidelberg, Münster, Kiel, and Jena, and also presence in business education handbooks and journals in the 1930s. In these handbooks would be employees by the IFK who would explain to businessmen how to use statistical methods and also how to use barometers. One of those barometers is a combination. So on the right hand side, you see two barometers, and the upper one you could diagnose the economic situation and then link it to your internal like purchasing, for example. And these ideas were directly inspired by the US, but I think a main difference between the US barometers and the German barometers were that in Germany you could do the diagnosis yourself. So really you could, by your own intuition, interpret the curves. What you also find in these handbooks is that on top of profitability, you see this mentioning of common economic interest as a guiding principle. And this is, of course, in line also with observing the business cycle, which is a bigger entity than your own small business. All right, we're already at the end. So my argument was that only by quantitative impersonality the business world could be convinced of the material, and this was done by the elimination of judgment, as Theodore Porter was mentioning. So you should leave out the diagnosis and forecast. But I think this case of the IFK also shows that this is not really enough. So only the elimination of judgment doesn't suffice. So you need also to make statistical materials, statistical methods more practical, and then also educate managers on how to use it. And especially if you look at the responses by the businessmen, you can see that it's kind of paradoxical way that quantitative impersonality allowed businessmen to use their intuition. So in the end, these fingertips were not really replaced, but you still use your fingertips with these compasses done, provided by the IFK. And again, so because of this intuition by the businessmen, they didn't really blindly follow what was told to them by the IFK, but they could really co-produce new material with the IFK and use this knowledge themselves. And this was really, to a certain degree, a sedimentation of the business cycle by this new material, which was then used on a daily basis for formulating and justifying actions. So, thank you.
Thank you, Marius. That was 15 minutes sharp.
Nice.
Now Lúcia is going to discuss your presentation.
So, thank you, Marius, for your presentation. I did enjoy reading your paper. I think you had a story to tell, and you didn't manage to tell this story very well. But I do have a few comments and a few suggestions to make. The first one is actually a suggestion. Some of these may sound like a question to you, but you don't actually need to answer. So maybe some things for you to keep in mind. But when I was reading your paper, so my first point, when I was reading your paper, I could not help but to remember a recently published paper in the Journal of the History of Economic Thought. This paper was published, I think, this year, and it was written by Evelyn Forget. And the point of the paper is that she was pointing out the need for us to start writing about knowledge brokers. And when I was reading your paper, I think that you were doing that. You were talking about knowledge brokers, because when you tell that the Berlin Institute used to publish weekly reports, index cards, and portable booklets, for me that was it. They were transforming raw material raw data, raw information into something that the society, the businessmen, they could understand. So when you are talking about what you're adding to the literature, I think it's maybe worth to mention this paper, because this is something that you are adding to our literature. You are responding to a call recently made in our field about the need for studying knowledge brokers. Okay.
Thank you.
So the second one is also a suggestion, because for me, when you're talking about Wagnermans, he was really important. He was essential to the success of Berlin Institute. But I was actually curious about what he did in life before becoming president. So maybe one paragraph, you told that he was trained by Schmuller, but with Schmuller and Schumpeter, but maybe one paragraph or two about his path in life before becoming president. It would be nice. And you told us this week that you were trying to reduce your paper, right?
Yeah.
So I think maybe this was why, but you wrote like, at page 15, you wrote 50 footnotes. So yeah. At some point, I think it was do your effort to try to reduce your paper. But at some point, I stopped reading them, because although some of them was actually interesting, it was difficult to maintain the flow of the reading, you know. But I think this is because you're trying to make your paper smaller.
Okay, thanks a lot.
That was it. Thank you again for your presentation. Thank you again for your paper. I think you do have a Q&A question.
Should I answer the Q&A like by typing or by?
It's up to you. I think you can answer Lúcia, and then you have 3 more questions on the Q&A.
Okay, so what is a barometer in this context? Depends on which barometer is talked about. Is it a Harvard barometer, or is it one later? I don't, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. So of course the Harvard barometer is the German one. So the one that combines 2 curves of these 42 curves, for example. So yeah, I would say, for example, the Harvard barometer is at the same time, I mean, is an instrument to trying to interpret the economy, but it's also the representation of the economy. So really this split into ABC is something that is probably different if you only look at the 42 curves, for example, than by having one concrete picture of how the economy works. So that, for example, the stock market moves first, then the commodity market, and finally the money market. So I think it's a different kind of barometer. So, for example, also in the German, so Wagnermann, for example, he would agree with the Harvard barometer in the beginning, but he would not follow, let's say, Karl Karsten's further development of causality. And so he has a different kind of approach on how to depict the economy. So there wouldn't be any causality in his curves, but his idea was really functionalism, so to collect as many curves as possible to get the overall picture. So I think it's a different kind of barometer. Also, of course, the term barometer might not be suitable for this kind of graphs, for this kind of curves, but Wagnermann was using these terms himself. Maybe the second one, is it a combination of curves or the separate curves? The first, which curves were chosen? This is also the German barometer? Yes, so yeah, this is a combination of curves. So you have, this one was employment, then long-term credit and new orders. And this barometer was not the following, was so not the curves that follow each other were important, but really the tensions between the curves. So if you had a big spread, for example, between credit and employment, between long-term credit and employment, Wagemann would say there's probably short-term credit that boosts employment, which would then make the situation more dangerous because he thought that short-term credits were more risky than long-term credits. So it's really a different, it's not the following that is the ABC curves that are represented in there, but really just to look at the tensions between these curves. Then the last one, question on the diffusion. So yeah, so the diffusion of the booklets, if you subscribe to these weekly reports, you got one for free, and you could order new ones for really not that much money, and several thousand of issues. I mean, it was public information for those who subscribed to this to the weekly reports. And what was Wagemann was also mentioning is that in his publications were reprinted in journals all over Germany. So he even thought about licensing these reprints to get more money.
Okay, so
Okay.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Does
so.
anyone
Thank
want
you.
to raise another question?
There's
No?
one last question from Harrow in the Q&A.
Ah, I didn't see
Oh,
that.
sorry.
Did you explain your thought? Yeah, I explained. Should I explain it again?
Yeah, start again your paper.
No, okay, good.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now, Lúcia is going to present her paper on the general equilibrium theory and the search of its empirical endorsements, Henry Ludwell Moore.
So, hello everyone. My name is Lúcia. I'm a PhD student at University of São Paulo. And this presentation, this paper is part of my PhD dissertation. I study in general the dissemination of Valrasian ideas right after Vallois' death. Vallois' deceased in 1910. So I studied the first decades of the 20th century. In this particular paper, I studied the dissemination of Valrasian ideas in the US with Henry Moore. Moore, he was a professor at Columbia University and one of the main founders of statistical economics. And he tried to make the original Valrasian model adapted in a way that it could be empirical verified. So this is my main goal, to study this attempt to make the Valrasian model statistically operative. My article also aims to evaluate how the academic community received Moore's work on Valrasian theory. And I did this by reading some book reviews and some reviews that he received over time. And I selected some particular reviews to discuss in the paper. And as I say, it's part of my PhD dissertation. So I also tried to discuss a little bit how statistics was being studied in Columbia at the time that Moore was a professor. how statistics was used in other social sciences, other social fields. I also made some comments about the development of pure statistical theory, just to have a general a notion of how close to the frontier Moore was when he was developing his statistical model. And the paper also makes some comments about the origin of variation theory, what the origin of variation theory has to say about verification, about empirical verification. Of course, this only could be a paper, what the origin of variation theory has to say about empirical verification, but I only made comments about things that were related to what Moore did. So the paper has two perspectives. In the first one, I analyzed the personal relationship between Vallois and Moore. And I did this by reading the letters that they exchanged in this period. And in the second one, I analyzed the works developed by Moore related to trying to make the original model adapted in a way that it could be empirical verified. So the conclusions in the first part, what I conclude by reading the letters that they exchange. The letters show Vallois' effort to try to disseminate his theory in the US and how he saw Moore as his American disciple. And it's really difficult to talk about the dissemination of a theory because we don't have, normally we don't have like something material to analyze it. But in this case, it was easier because what Vallois he wanted, it was that Moore translated into English a material that he had prepared to be used in teaching. So for him, dissemination would begin in the classroom. But Moore, he did not translate the material. This was done only in 1954 by Jaffe. Moore, he told Vallois that Vallois underestimated the difficulty of his ideas, his method, and Vallois' final attempt to get a translation was done by him asking another American professor, Professor Farnon. And Professor Farnon, he tried to publish in Columbia University Studies this abrégé, this material to be used in the classroom. But Columbia University Studies, the publishing company, they did not agree with the publication because they expected a low return and a high cost in the enterprise. And the one last point that I was able to conclude by reading the letters is that Moore was actually important in the decision that Vallois did to write an autobiography. So Moore, he kept telling Vallois that this was something that the body of knowledge needed. Economic science needed works showing how the knowledge was developed, was built by people who believed in Moore's words, heart and soul, in what they were developing, in what they are defending as. Vallois was an example of this. Someone who believed in what they are doing, although he faced many difficulties by developing the mathematization of economics, his general equilibrium model. And the conclusions that I made by reading Moore's work. So he did not translate the material that Vallois wanted that he translated, but in a way he started the dissemination of general equilibrium theory in the United States because he tried to adapt the original model, and this is why this is what I analyze in the second part. But before that, it's one of the conclusions. Moore, he did not develop any statistical work prior to becoming a professor at Columbia. So there were in the university other professors in the social sciences, in sociology and anthropology, psychology, that they were trying to use statistics in their fields. So there was a supportive environment in Columbia University to use statistics in social science. One important thing, I think, too, is that Moore, he criticized Marshall's approach, the ceteris paribus clause, because for him, he accused using this clause of being an useless speculation. He defends that we should analyze variables while maintaining other variables changing accordingly with natural changes and not maintaining them changeless. And talking about hypotheses, Moore used to say that he abandoned the hypothesis of absolute computation, although he was using Vallois' model, because he defended that he was trying to make his model more close to reality. So absolute competition wasn't so close to reality, and he used only the hypothesis of competition and not absolute competition. In competition, in meaning a society in which each economic agent seeks the maximum gain that he could get. Another important point is that he emphasized the need for theories to be useful and mostly useful for forecast. And forecast, by its turn, was supposed to improve the economy's outcome, to improve people's life and mainly the working class. So for him, the only way to overcome Marxist theory would be doing this, using the model to forecast, to improve the economy's outcome, to improve the working class life, because Marxist theory, they would not be overcome by refutation, by ridiculizing them, or by persecuting them. The only way to overcome them was improving the worker's life. And last thing, but actually one of the most important ones, is that I told you in the beginning that my goal was to analyze the model that he developed. And I conclude that the main analytical tool that he used to transform the original Valloisian model was treating the data using a secular trend. So instead of using price, he used price in relation with price trend value. But for him, in some works, he points that data variation has three sources: secular change, cyclical change, and random change. So if we only judge his working by his own standards, treating data with secular, treating data with trend, only would deal with one of these sources of one of these sources of data variation that was secular change. And he also said he finished his last work saying that his model, his adapted model, was able to demonstrate that the formulation was able to demonstrate that we could prove the productivity theory of distribution. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lúcia. So now Maria is going to discuss your work.
Hi, thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, Lúcia, for that interesting presentation and for your paper. So I have a couple of things I liked, and then kind of a bigger point about where I think there's room for improvement. So I really liked the beginning of your paper where you had these impressions of Moore, and they're very, I mean, you have several different sources there, lots of great quotes and so on, and I think that's really great. I think it gives, it really contextualizes well who Moore was, etc., and who his kind of entourage was. Both, you know, you mentioned the kind of people, what people said, what good things people said about him, and then what other critique, kind of more negative critique you found of him. And just in general, this is my second point, in general, I think you have a really detailed and thorough contextualization of more your protagonist, but also generally the kind of the context. You look at his university context, etc. So that's really good. Now, but the things where I think there's room for improvement, generally it concerns your overall thesis statement. So for me, it's kind of missing. It perhaps is there in the introduction and I've just missed it, but I think that can give you an idea of perhaps it needs to be a little bit more, a little bit clearer, a little bit more, it needs to pop out a little bit more to the reader. So, you know, for example, what's the significance of your paper as well? What's your particular contribution and how does that fit into the overall literature? Because I imagine there's lots more written on this topic, which I won't personally know, but that was missing in the paper. And then, so that's the overall kind of thesis statement and what your contribution is within this literature. But then going through the paper, the kind of overall, then there wasn't this kind of tying back to your thesis statement. So, you know, what's the significance of Moore's correspondence with Walras? How is this important? What does it tell us? And this is made a little bit clearer in the conclusion, but I would have liked to have seen it before. And this might just be my kind of Anglophone way of wanting to see how papers, you know, let me rephrase that. This may be my Anglophone preferences for how papers are written, but I'd like to see more of the stuff that you say in the conclusions throughout the paper. And so just to sum that up, I see lots of great trees, but I don't see the forest so much. If that helps, that imagery for you. It helped me a lot when I write, so thank you.
Thank you, Maria. We'll keep this in mind, and I think it's true. I may need to take things out of the conclusion and put it in the main text. That is true. I had kind of difficult to do this, but this is something that I need to work out. Thank you again. So I have some questions in QA. Vallois really thought in terms of disciple. Yes, he mentioned, I can't remember now the word in French, but he mentioned several times this word that was disciple in French. So Vallois really thought in terms of a disciple, yes, and not only about Moore, but actually about other young researchers in France. For example, Alberto Petit, that is another author that I am studying. He thought about him as a disciple. is there a connection between Leontiev and Moore? There are some similarities. I don't know, but maybe this is something that I can search. I don't remember Moore talking about Leontiev in his works, but I read all these a year ago, so maybe this is my bad memory. Thanks a lot for your presentation. This is interesting. I don't actually know about this link between Moore and Clark. I am in New York, and I was supposed to consult Moore's archival at Columbia University, but then Corona happened, and I was not able to consult the archival. So the only source of information that I have until now that I used to write my paper was the correspondences between Moore and Vallois. So I do think that I may learn a lot by reading other correspondences that Moore exchanged with other people, but I was not able to do this until now. Besides Schutz, were there any other dissertation students of Moore? Yes, but I think Schutz was the most famous one.
Okay, so are there any more questions? No? Okay, so I think Maria, it's your turn. You can. So we have Maria back with her article, Enriching the Concept of Poverty Through Travel. Romesh Chandra Dutt travels to Europe in the late 19th century.
Thank you, Nicolas. So I'm just gonna share my screen here. Great, hopefully everybody can see that.
Yes.
So I've changed the title just slightly because the title was just a little bit too long at the beginning, and then I thought of this idea of theory and action, which I'm gonna explain in a couple of the slides. And so Romesh Chandra Dutt here is pictured, who was an Indian civil servant, writer, poet, an economic historian. He was what most people would say the founder of agricultural economics in India. And as I go through the presentation, I'll mention a few more things about him. It's true that when one studies these lesser known economists, we often have to spend lots of time just introducing them before we can actually get into the nitty gritty. So I won't have time in the presentation to explain all the things he was, and I hope that that's, you know, answered in the paper. But all right, so how do I go forward? There we go. All right, so I wrote this paper as part of a project by Haromas and Maru Bovansky, which asks, how does traveling contribute to knowledge formation? And so I started off reading a few articles, kind of the few scanned articles that exist in the history of economics, and then in the wider field of kind of history of science, about, you know, what does travel do to the, you know, if an economist goes somewhere, right, he leaves, or she leaves her home and goes somewhere else, what happens then to the ideas, theories, models that they're coming up with through this travel? And so I came up with this I found in the research this idea of theory and action that actually, you know, the kind of the origins of the word theory has this action of leaving one's home, right? So you have to do an action in order to understand and produce theory, and that's why the title changed to this poverty theory in action, because I've concentrated on Dutt's idea of poverty, which was his main research topic, understanding why India in the late 19th century had such extreme poverty. And he went off to Europe several times. He even, in the end, ended up teaching at UCL, University College of London. He ended up teaching Indian history there for a year. So he spent a lot of time in England, but he also traveled around Europe. And he has this travel log called 3 Years in Europe, which was first published in 1872, of his first travel to Europe from 1868 to 1871, when he goes off to India with a friend to take the civil servant examination, which only existed in London at the time, and he was the second Indian to become a civil servant in the colonial administration in India. So he was kind of one of the first pioneers to go off to England and to study at UCL and take this examination, and then, you know, he ended up passing, etc. And so he writes home during this time, and then is asked by his publisher to publish these letters, you know, edited forms of the letters, into a travelogue. And it's called 3 Years in Europe because that's the first edition of the book, was only these first 3 years, and then he published, he added chapters to the travelogue, and eventually published his fourth edition in 1896, and then he included 3 trips around Europe, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But so going back to this idea, then how does travel contribute to knowledge formation? Well, I look at then the travelogue, and I link that then to his published works in economics, and I talk about travelogues including 3 spaces. It includes the protagonist's home, so in the case of Dutt, India. It includes the foreign space, of course, Europe, and then it includes this third space, which is this thing produced when an economist goes to a foreign space and exists there, right, with their own assumptions, ideas about the world, the economy, etc., and of course changes that space as well, right? So, and then how do you then analyze that third space? Well, I took Paul Cohen's idea of experience. Paul Cohen is an historian, and he talks about thoughts, feelings, and behavior of immediate participants. So I kind of pulled those things out of the travelogue while I was doing my archival research. And so just to be kind of very explicit, I'm not asking here whether travel affects knowledge formation or not. I'm rather asking how, and I think we can all kind of agree with the fact that if we've traveled, we know that it does change or confirm or does something to us, at least when we travel. Okay, so going back to this travelogue, then Dutt publishes, he's quite clear in the beginning that he's one of the first to travel to England at the time, so one of the first Indians to travel to England, and so this is why his book, when it was first, his travelogue, when it was first published, was kind of one of the first, and then, you know, traveling became much more extensive a couple of decades, even just 10 years later. But and so the first part of the book is his first 3 years in Europe, and then he and that was when he traveled with his friend. The second trip he took with his whole family, including his brother, his several children, his wife, etc. And what's really quite I think, I'll go here first, yeah. What I think is quite incredible about this is that he traveled far and wide in Europe. I mean, he has been to more places in Europe than I have. And of course, some of the places it was as a tourist, right? Especially if we're talking about the northern regions, you know, in Norway and Sweden here, as you see there, he was with a group of, so it was like a guided tour in a sense, whereas in England, he traveled, as you can see, it's lots of red dots there. He traveled as part of or he was invited to go to Western England to be part of a colonial committee. So this was kind of a colonial reception for Indians and British at the time to start to gain more links between Indians and British. And there, so in England, he would have seen quite a lot of different spaces, etc., and including, I think, poverty. And there, I'm going to go on to that in a little bit and to see, try to figure out what he actually saw. And just before I go on to talk a little bit more about that, the reason I choose to look at poverty is that's one of his main research interests, and he talks about poverty in the travel log. And of course, this I think is important as well, because the Indian economists at the time really preferred this idea of comparative methods, right? So he went to England, and he was quite explicit about this in the travelogue, to understand modernity, to experience it. And of course, to understand modernity, that also makes you understand the opposite, right? Poverty, extreme poverty. And he does mention poverty in especially England at the time. So he doesn't just see modernity, right? Okay. All right, and these are just a couple of kind of, as we're presenting and as we can have images, I thought this would be at least interesting to see that there's wide. So here's, for Marius here, there's the Lake of Geneva, and we have, Venice, Paris, and we have the fjords in Norway. So he, as I said, he did really travel far and wide. And I think at least his first trip, during his first trip, that would have been quite exceptional for an Indian to do. And I presented this at a workshop a few days ago, and it is true that I need to figure out a little bit more, how did he have the means to do this? He's definitely part of the elite, etc. But it would be interesting to find out how he got the means to travel, especially the first time before he was, started his proper career within the Indian civil service. Okay, so there's this idea of the travel theorem in economics, that you don't need to travel anywhere. You can find out more from your local library than traveling somewhere. And so why is it then that Dutt feels the need to reject the travel theorem, right? And I think there are kind of 3 points here that I think are important to understand. First of all, Indians were from the margins, right? They've only recently been considered economists. I find that one of my main aims in my work is really to bring these Indian economists into the debates in history of economics, into economic debates. They haven't been before. So of course they need to legitimize themselves more. And we can imagine that perhaps then traveling is necessary for that. They needed to travel to Europe to experience modernity, right? How can you theorize on development, which is what my PhD research was on, right? How can you theorize on that if you haven't experienced it? So they have to travel to Europe. But then what's interesting, right, is that he also sees poverty in Europe. So is perhaps, poverty more universal than he thought before? And that still is kind of yet to be answered in this first draft of my paper. That's kind of things I'm thinking about. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but I guess I don't have too much time. So I'll go through quickly here. So this idea of poverty theory in action. So how much of poverty does he see? He does describe poverty, especially in England, quite vividly, both poverty in the urban area as well as in the rural area. He actually compares them and says that rural poverty is relatively better than urban poverty, because the rural poor have better kind of more friendly relations with their landlords and their bosses. They also have more space, right? There's not as much overcrowding. And so that's kind of, these are the things that he says about poverty in England is really this: the fact that there's tight quarters, there's lots of overcrowding, they have lots of children before they have the means, he says, there's not enough food, it's also very cold. And this point is interesting because he actually says that because of the climate, poverty can be seen as worse in England to some extent, because the climate is obviously much colder in England than in India. There's lots of disease. There's also lots of violence, which he mainly blames on alcohol abuse. Again, this is an interesting comparison with India. He doesn't explicitly say this, but of course, alcohol is kind of more widely accessible in England than in India at the time. Right? Okay. This is just my last slide and then I'll finish. So I think, you know, his aim to go to Europe to understand modernity and poverty better, I think is not so much shown through the travelogue, but is shown through his other published works. So that's my main conclusion. And then the other things here are kind of what I think I need to do more of, I need to think about more. So is poverty more universal than he originally thought? Because you do really get a sense that poverty exists everywhere. I mean, he does say, for example, that the Swiss poor are happy. And apparently other economists at this time are saying the same thing. So that's something I maybe need to look into. Now, how is poverty connected to inequality? Because he's very concerned about the inequality between rural and urban areas in India. So this would be quite interesting to look more into. Now, where does he get his information from, right? When I presented this paper at a conference, Mary Morgan says, you know, how does he get the idea that there's 2 million people unemployed in England during the Long Depression, right? That's interesting. And I think I need to figure out what kind, perhaps he read some poverty reports, the parliamentary debates, etc. in England. I know he went to some of the, you know, the debates there, so the discussions. So, and then the kind of two last points are connected in a sense, because he starts to travel off saying, you know, none of our family members know that we're leaving, him and his friend, because it would be, you know, they would think that it would not be fruitful, we're never going to pass this exam and so on. And I think Harrow is a participant here, so I'll say it, you know, Harrow mentioned, but how is that possible? How does he get the money to do that? And so really the question is, you know, what does he want the readers to think when you read the travelogue? Right, so thank you for listening. That's it for me.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to discuss your presentation. Could you please just quit sharing your screen?
I'm trying to.
Okay.
How do I do that? End show. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Maria, for your presentation. Yeah, so I was very interested in your article because, first of all, your claim that it fills a gap in the history of economics on traveling economists, especially on how the travels affect an economist's thinking. I was interested in that because this is also something I had the impression while I was working on my article. So I feel there was something of a confirmation of something I was working on. So your work is based on Dutt's travelogue, 3 years in Europe. And your main argument is that this travelogue is a refutation of the travel theorem, the idea that travel do not matter for economists. And if I understood well, your main argument is also that there is a major impact of Dutt's European trips on his theory of poverty. So I just have 3 questions on your work. First, about this idea of a gap in the history of economic thought literature. Did you find something in Indian history, or I don't know, history of social science? This is something you mentioned at some point, that there is a specific literature, especially on Dutt, but I don't know if you had, if already somebody works on his travelogue. Second question is about the generalization of your work. In a sense, when I was reading your article, I sensed that there was some kind of a general pattern related to colonialism and imperialism. On the one hand, you have economists, European economists, saying basically that travels do not matter, we can stay in the library. On the other side, you have Dutt and maybe other Indian elites that feel the need to travel to Europe. So my question is, maybe it's part of a general pattern. But third question is comments as a reader that I wanted to share. First comment is about the publication of the travelogue. I think this is something very important in the paper, and maybe we as a reader wanted to know more, because it was meant to be a travel guide by the editor. But the question is did Dutt thought that there was more than that? In other words, did he consider himself that his travels were a source of inspiration for his theories? And my last comments is about, as a historical reader, we sometimes want to know more about the chronological details of your argumentation. You mentioned trips in 1869, 1886, and 1893. But maybe, I don't know if you find something in your historical sources, maybe you don't have anything, but maybe you can connect this more explicitly to the elaboration of his theory of poverty. That's it.
Oh yeah, this is really helpful. Thank you, Nicolas. So your first, I didn't write those things down.
Sorry. Sorry.
You mind putting it up there again? Because I'm going to be lazy and ask you to send that to me. So yeah, the first point about whether this exists in the scholarship. I mean, there are a couple of things now I found, that they've talked about Dutt, but they haven't talked about how that traveling has impacted his idea of poverty. That's not been done at all before, but it has, his travels to England have been dealt with, in a few sources. So I can't say it's not been done at all, but it's still quite scant. The literature, there's a whole book on traveling Indian travelers to Europe, on how this helped them build a nation. And that's kind of the main, if you think about history of conceptual history and intellectual history, all that history of science in India, it's really about, they choose nationalism and then they look at different characters. So I'm kind of, that research really helps me to but I'm trying to move away from that and look at kind of economics more so, rather than the political kind of, rather than history of political thought, I look at history of economic thought, right? So yeah, so this kind of, I partly answered this, other Indians traveling to Europe, yes, and definitely after Dutt, much more, and it was, I think, a kind of coming of age thing at the time, if you had the means, of course, so it's still part of the Indian elites that were able to go, and for a time, they had to go to take the civil examination in England. Eventually they were able to do it in India, but yeah, so there are cases, and maybe that needs to come into the paper, so that's a really good point. So then the last 2 points that you have, yes, travel guide. That's really interesting question. And again, that comes back to my last question at the end, the next steps, like what does Dutt want us to think about this? And would not surprise me if the travelogue was also a means to be a political activist and to be fighting for nationalism, which is his goal with all his contemporaries. So yeah, I need to look into that more. And then the last one is a really good starting point for me, because I think I haven't done that enough, connected the travelogue with his published works, and just starting off chronologically will help me to start to do that. So that's great. Now I have a few questions. So first one, how did he define poverty? He would have used Naruji's definition of poverty, which was, so this is Dabada Naruji, was the Indian economist. He's kind of the most famous Indian economist really of this time, who came up with the drain theory, and he brought together statistics to show, to come up with a national account, so a number for the national account of India in 1867 to 1868, and then he compared that to the cost of shelter and food and clothing for inmates in prisons in India, and then because those two numbers, the number of, how much it costs to live was much lower than the kind of the GDP of today. He said it was poverty. There was extreme poverty in India. So it would have, for him, it would have been about, you know, if someone was in extreme poverty, they didn't have shelter, they didn't have food, they didn't have clothing, right? I don't know if that helps. Taking into account cultural differences, there I would be a little bit more, perhaps maybe not so much in the texts in English, and they didn't really talk about castes at this time because that was such a touchy subject, because they wanted to what's the word I'm looking for? They wanted to create a national feeling, and they wanted to build a nation, right? And so they didn't want to talk too much about castes to split the Indians, because they needed to be a kind of a united front against the British, their imperial rulers. I hope that answers those questions, Marcel. Cleo. So was Dutt welcomed with respect as a tourist intellectual? He was definitely welcomed with respect as a tourist, for sure. I mean, as an intellectual, yes, towards the end of, so in 1897, I believe, and so this is not part of the travel log. He was invited to be so he was employed to be a professor in Indian history at the UCL, and there he was, you know, welcomed with respect as an intellectual. And actually there's a secondary resource that says, you know, that's one of the few moments he's had a lot of success in diffusing his ideas outside of India. But in the travelogue, it's more about him being welcomed as a tourist, and certainly he was. And how were the destinations chosen? Yeah, that's really interesting. I need to go back. There's sometimes he mentions it, but very rarely. Good question though, and I'll look into that. Sarah. So dichotomy of modernity and poverty. Yeah, so for sure, modernity is the solution to poverty. That's quite clear in both what the Indians are being taught at the imperial universities as of the mid-19th century, and then what the actual Indian economists say. But yes, it's true then that Dutt says, well, actually sees that yes, there's poverty with modernity, and he's quite explicit about the fact that there's still lots to do. Like there's a sentence where he says, but modernity still has lots to do. Yeah, really interesting point. I would need to think about it a bit more. Yes, Marcel's suggestion, I've been told about that work. I've read a bit of his work, but I should go look at it more for this paper. And then Harrow is asking what the meaning of modernity is. Well, the meaning of modernity is industrialization, higher standards of living, so lower levels of poverty, education, but that is circular. I'm not sure. But Harrow, would you mind using your mic? Not sure.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, I think you can, Harrow. Oh, that's okay. Oh, well, I think we may need to discuss that, Harrow. I'm circular. I'm not sure I understand, or if I understood whether I would have the answer. I'm just seeing there's also a question in the chat, right, from Jibana. I'm probably saying that wrong. So how does Dutt establish a network through his travels? yeah, so he doesn't talk about it a lot, but he does mention when he's off to Sweden and Norway, and I think that's really the trip where he's the furthest out of his comfort zone. He goes with a travel agency, and travel agency in London, and I think he gets word of this by someone, like by a friend. Yeah, so how does his economics change? Yeah, this goes back to Nicolas' point about, chronologically, when does he publish his works? And I need to do some of this work. And then the last question is, does he elaborate or distinguish relative from absolute poverty? Yeah. Yeah, relative and absolute poverty. This is really, I think he hints at it when he talks about, the Swiss poor are, even the poor in Switzerland are happy. I think that's where he's really hinting at this idea of relative poverty, but he's not explicit, so he doesn't really elaborate or distinguish that. The last question here, and any mention of social movements, socialism, etc. So not in the travel log, but and Dutt doesn't really discuss it. There's another couple of economists, Naruji and Wacha, who talk about that they're very explicit that they're not socialist, even though some of their arguments you can say are quite similar to the ideas in socialism. Getting the state to help with poverty, etc. But I think just politically at the time, they have a hard time associating with socialism, because they do need to win the respect, and they need to win some, they need to win the respect, and they need to get the British to listen to them at the time in order to bring about independence. So hopefully that answers that last question. Okay, Haro has a follow-up question. Yeah, how does Dutt perceive modernity before coming, and how does he readjust his image? Yeah, this is where I need to start, I think. This is my next step.
Okay, so maybe we can move on. Are there any other questions or something you want to add? No?
No, I think that was great. Thank you so much for all those comments, suggestions, and questions.
Thank you, Maria. So now it's my turn. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so first of all, I shall say this because it doesn't appear on the conference webpage, I think. So this paper is co-authored with Sarah Imhoff, who's participating to this session too. So this article is on a very specific topic, but I think it could interest a larger audience because it relates to the theme of this session, and also because it is a case study of rhetorical analysis. So it raises larger questions about the role of rhetorics and metaphors in economics. So this is a rhetorical analysis of the word Luftmentsh in Yiddish, which breaks into two components. First component is Luft, which means air, and Mensch, which means man, person, or human being. So literally, a Luftmentsh in Yiddish is an air person or a person living in the air. And it was an expression which was used to refer to different kinds of Jewish paupers in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. So this is a very complex metaphor, but the basic meaning is that Luftmentsh were said to float in the air, in the sense that they lack of definite professions. They were also said to live from the air, in the sense of living from nothing and being in a state of extreme poverty. So the word Luftmentsh appeared in the Yiddish literature in the 1860s, and it began to be used in economic discourse in the late 19th century. And it is now part of economic popular culture, at least Jewish popular culture. So beyond literature, the theme of floating Jews is important in Jewish art in general, especially in paintings, in the paintings of Marc Chagall, such as this one. If you look in Jewish literature and Jewish art in general, you see that most of the times Luftmentsh are comic characters. This is especially the case of Menachem Mendel. Menachem Mendel is the anti-hero of a novel by a Yiddish writer, Sholem Aleichem. He's a guy trying to make a fortune in big cities. So he dabbles unsuccessfully in different Luft occupation, speculative activities. And he always ends up losing his money and failing in his businesses. So he's also what is called in Yiddish a schlimmel, that is to say the unlucky, clumsy guy who has great ambitions but always fails. And as such, he has been a major source of inspiration for many books, movies, novels, fiction, and so forth. So there was indeed some form of mockery toward Luftmentsh in Yiddish literature, but at the same time, there was also a form of aestheticization, that is to say, the attribution of a positive aesthetic value to poverty. And this relates in particular to often to a self-ironical attitude of Yiddish writer toward Luftmentsh, because many of these Yiddish writers picture themselves as Luftmentsh. So the historian Nicolas Berg wrote a book about Luftmentsh, and his argument is that when the word began to be used in economic discourse, the word lost its self-ironical and positive content, and it became only a pejorative word. So in this article, we discuss this interpretation and we analyze in detail the transition from Yiddish literature to economic discourse. This paper is also intended to be a contribution to the existing literature in the history of economic thought about metaphors and rhetorical analysis. And more generally, from the perspective of intellectual history, it is also meant to provide a critical analysis of this figure of Luftmentsh and deconstruct the ambivalent attitudes towards this designation, especially pertaining to gender. So our analysis is based on the works of a single economist and statisticians writing in Yiddish, Yakov Leshinsky. So this is not a paper about Yakov Leshinsky, but we give a few reasons why we chose to study this economist in particular. So the main reason is that he was a major actor. He played a very important role among Jewish statisticians and economists writing in Yiddish at the time. So actually, the first section is not about Leshinsky's works. Actually, we looked to many occurrences of the word Luftmentsh in early 20th century statisticians writing in German. And we show that actually most of them ignored the exact origin of the word in Yiddish literature. And we trace back the diffusion of the word from an influential discourse of Max Nordau, who was an important Zionist leader at the time. So the result of this analysis is that the use of the word Luftmentsh in this German literature is consistent with the thesis of Nicolas Berg, because in these occurrences, we see that the word was mostly a pejorative word. And it can be suggested that the air metaphor in this case was what Lage calls a dead metaphor, that is to say, a metaphor that does not any longer work as such, because it became only a catchword or a synonym for Jewish poverty. So then our argument basically is to say that Leszczyński's case is a more complex case. First of all, because he was familiar with the original in Yiddish. He wrote extensively in Yiddish, and he even wrote a book on the history of Yiddish literature. And this matters because in Yiddish, the air metaphor is more complex, and there are many derivatives of the original expression. So we collected for these derivatives. So for instance, the expression of Luftartnisse or Luftgeschäften, which means air businesses or air incomes. And we suggest that in these cases, in Leszczyński's case, the air metaphor was not a dead metaphor, but it was part of a routine vocabulary to refer to Jewish poverty. We also tried to identify words and expression with which the word Luftmentsh was associated. We identified what we call terminological chains of words. And from these chains, we identified several semantic domains, that is to say, theme or ideas with which the air metaphor was related. So for instance, several expressions suggest the idea of shady businesses and idleness. Several other expressions, the idea of floating and wandering and so forth. And the main results is that here again, in the case of Leszczyński, Luftmentsh remained a pejorative word. But there were much more ambivalence in his case. So for instance, an expression such as Luftgeist, which means air mentality or air spirits, could have in some context a positive meaning relating to creativity, intellectual agility, and so forth, and in some other context, negative meaning associated, for instance, with the idea of lack of discipline of Jewish worker. So basically our argument is that Leszczyński's rhetoric toward Jewish paupers was not reducible to a pure contempt toward Luftmentsh. But the major arguments of this paper, and it is also intended as an objection to Berg, is that there was, in Leszczyński's case, a fundamental continuity between his economic writings and Yiddish literature. This continuity can be explained, of course, first by the fact, as I said, that he was very familiar with Yiddish literature. He made a lot of reference to it in his writing. But more importantly, this has to be understood, this continuity between economic discourse and Yiddish literature has to be understood in the context of Leszczyński's audience, which was very similar to the one of Yiddish novelists and writers at the time. Because like many Jewish statisticians and economists in Eastern Europe at the time, Leszczyński could not attain academic positions, so he had to work as a journalist. And actually, he was very well known as a journalist. But what is important is that Jewish newspaper at the time published both fiction and economics, politics, and so forth. So just to give you a short example, this is the front page of Ayen's, which was one of the most important Yiddish newspaper at the time, and in which Leszczyński wrote a weekly economic column called Von Ökonomischen Leben. And in the same page, you had Sholem Aleichem writing episodes of his novel Menachem Mendel. So the reader of such journals could read on some day economic analysis by Leshinsky, and the other day a story or an episode of a story of Sholem Menachem. So this proximity between economics and literature explains why the air metaphor fulfilled what Bessoni called an epistemological function. That is to say, it was used to transfer to one process the kind of explanation governing to another one. Here, basically, the argument, in simple words, is that Leshinsky considered that storytelling, Yiddish literature, writing stories, could be used in economics, and he regarded at least part of his own discourse as a form of storytelling that we call statistical storytelling. And as such, we suggest that he was largely influenced by a previous and large Jewish tradition of travelogues and social investigation on poverty. And this relates to the theme of Maria's presentation. I think this is interesting because here we have an example of an economist who does and says explicitly, look, my writings are indeed inspired by literature. Metaphors are part of my discourse. And this is interesting because critics of the rhetorical approach usually say that, yes, economists might use metaphors, but it does not really matter. It does not imply that economics equals storytelling. And also because most economists who have been studied by such rhetorical analysis do not themselves usually the importance of metaphor. So here, I think this case study changed a bit the usual perspective or the usual pattern of this rhetorical analysis of economic discourse. So this is not to say that Leshinsky had perfect writing skills, that he mastered perfectly his own rhetoric. The air metaphor in his writing also conveyed unintended meanings, meanings that were not consistent with the rest of his discourse. There were also implicit meanings, meanings that Leshinsky did not see or did not see as important, yet conveying important ideas, important assumption, personal bias, and this pertains in particular to gender. So in this paper, we also discuss the assumptions of the air metaphor of this figure of Luftmentsh regarding gender. So one could say at first that there is nothing to say here, because Leshinsky never said that Luftmenschen are men or women. It seems that he was not interested in this question. And also one could say that Luftmentsh is a mensch, that is to say a man, but it can be understood as a human being in the universal sense of the expression. But this is clearly not the case. If you look in cultural history, you see that almost all embodiments of Luftmenschen are men. The expression Luftfreuen or Luftweib, which means which would be the feminine for the same expression, do not exist. And of course, this is not pure random. There are cultural explanations for this. This fact reflects dominant masculine norms in Ashkenazi society. So we argue that this figure of the Luftmentsh, provide a figure of Jewish masculinity. That is to say, it provides identification model for Jewish men and not for women. And we think this is important because it can help to challenge the idea that, I quote my co-author here, gender equals women and that women have gender and men do not. And I think it matters, this idea matters also in our field, in the history of economic thought, because you can challenge the idea that, for instance, You know, if you study a male economist working on macroeconomic models, well, this is not a gendered topic, so there is nothing to say about gender in this matter. So the idea is that gender is not a topic, it's a different and improved method to read and interpret our sources that applies to women, but also to men and to every topic in the history of economic thought. Thank you. So Marius is...
yes, exactly. Thanks a lot, Nicolas. I really enjoyed reading your paper. So as a German native speaker, you always enjoy these Yiddish terms. I have several questions and comments. But maybe the first question is, do you know this? In your presentation, you mentioned the comic, and I didn't see this in your paper. Maybe I just overread it. But do you know the comic Struwwelpeter? So there's this Struwwelpeter. I can write it to you later. But there's this comic in mid-19th century that depicts a child who is called Hans Guck in die Luft. So a child who's always looking at the sky and walks around. So he stumbles over a dog, and then in the end he falls into the water. And I think this is really something, and probably is Yiddish as well. So maybe you want to look into that. And I think it's even before your origin. So it's of 1845 is the book, the comic. So, and of course it's also the same notion of someone daydreaming and not being productive because he loses his books, for example, on the way, and he doesn't pay attention to reality. So this might be a nice comparison. For the comments, so I had a bit issues with the metaphors. So I didn't really understand the Luftmentsh itself as a metaphor. So what was clear to me was, for example, that you use this idea of source, target, tertium comparationis, and then the target. So I understood this in terms of air and Mensch, but then the use of Luftmentsh in economics was for me not so obvious. And I think also this distinction is a little bit artificial because you later in the paper you say also that those who are writing literature on economics were publishing in the same journal. So I don't see a big difference between the domains of literature and economics. So maybe it didn't really get through, but yeah. And so this was one point. Another one I think is really specific on the paper, and I think it really sounded interesting to me, is when you talk about this really nice example of this interview in the village, where you can clearly see that with statistics it's hard to grasp this Luftmentsh because he doesn't do anything, so it's hard to put him in a category, and so you don't know where he's living, where he's working, so somehow you lose this person. So this is really this residual. I think you also mentioned Luftmentsh as a residual, and I was wondering then at the same time that you mentioned that some statistics, so your author was interpreting certain statistics, and he was mentioning Luftmentsh in that. So what is, if you don't define someone in a statistical term, how can he still have influence on statistics? So maybe you can link this with this idea of residual. So I mean, also in statistics, you talk about residual, something that you don't explain, you cannot explain. So I think this might be an interesting comparison, or maybe also just, another approach than metaphor. So and another thing was when economists talk about Luftmentsh, as soon as they take up this idea of Luftmentsh, you talk really quickly about this category. So did they have this idea of Luftmentsh? So Luftmentsh with poverty, did they have this category before, or did they need something coming outside of statistics, for example, or outside of economics to define a new category? Or was this, what was new about this Luftmentsh then in the specificity of statistics? So maybe a last point is also then yeah, these positive and negative sides of the Luftmentsh, and this of course resonates with Horkheimer and Adorno. So you have this modern anti-Semitism that has both ideas of the clever Jew, but also the stupid one, and in every terms there's always this kind of contradiction between cleverness and stupidness. So maybe you want to include that as well.
Thank you, Marius. So I will answer your question first. About your first question on, it was a reference, I didn't know you sent me the
Maybe
reference.
I type it.
In any case, yeah, I went really fast about the figure of the Luftmentsh in Yiddish literature in general. This is a huge subject. There are already books on this subject. Our article is specifically on the transition from Yiddish literature to economics. So yes, there are hundreds of references, and there are also many conflicted, many opposition in Yiddish literature, different representation of the Luftmentsh. So, for instance, the main character, the main popular character in Yiddish literature was Menachem Mendel, and he's actually a very specific type of Luftmentsh because he's a speculator. He's the one that goes to the big city. He's a financial speculator, but you have different representation. For instance, Fischke der Krumme, who was he's the image of the small peddler or the small beggar in his shtetl, in his small village. So you have different representation. This is a very rich imaginary. And of course, I could speak very much longer on that, but the subject of the article is only on the transition from literature to economics. About your question about how this relates to statistics and statistical classification, in a sense, at first, that is something I tried to explain. You had in the early 20th century, particularly in German writing economics, you had many authors saying that, yeah, these people are Luftmentsh when they were commenting, statistics about employment structure. So when they observed that there were many people self-employed or many people without occupation or too many people in commercial or in petty trades and stuff like that, they could say, well, these people are probably Luftmentsh. So in a sense, you can say it can be read as a mere synonym for Jewish poverty. It was borrowed from literature and it became only a synonym for poverty. But I think there is more than that, because it always came with a sense that this figure was much more complex. First, in statistical terms. So as I said, most Luftmentsh were understood in statistical terms as people self-employed without occupation, men self-employed without occupation, and so forth. And it also came with the sense that these people were actually escaping the classification. They couldn't be properly classified. So this raised a very important question for statisticians, because when they say that they were Luftmentsh, there were also important assumptions about the method of statistical classification. So I don't know if that's answer well your question, but so I see maybe other questions. So Haromas. Yeah.
No, you can answer. I have a question if that's okay.
Yeah, go on.
I mean, or do you want to answer the questions first?
No, go on.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I just had a couple of really quick points. The kind of story you tell seems to say that poverty is self-inflicting to a certain extent, right? It's this, you talked about the story of the person who tries lots of different things and then doesn't succeed. So to me, it felt like kind of the onus was put on the actual person to make ends meet, which I think is an ongoing theme in poverty, right? And I mean, the passages that I saw in the travelogue that I looked at was talking about how, poverty led to alcoholism and then violence. And again, that's kind of it was ugly, and there was partly, there was an, you know, kind of, if you read between the lines, it was, you know, their own fault. And this word Luft, I mean, even in Swedish, this means air. And I'm just, and maybe I'm wrong here, but for me, that brings up this idea of someone who has just air in his brain, right, is unintelligent. So that it's connected to this idea of, so is poverty then self-inflicting, right? Is it that people are born with, you know, brain air instead of brains, and that's why they're, you know, or do they develop brains that are full of air rather than good things? So I don't know if that kind of connection exists in Yiddish as well. And of course that, you know, brings us to what you were saying too about how you can't measure these people, right? They're air, they're inexistent as well, right? Because so you mentioned before, it's about them living from air, but also their air themselves, right? In a sense, I found. And then just on this second comment I have, and Cleo has here rightfully said at the end, she's loved to see that there was a reference to masculinity studies. And I think that's really good too, that you bring that up, that it is a man that you're talking about. And the newest book that came out last year by a journalist in the UK, Invisible Woman, talks a lot about how the way we talk is a person is a man, right? And I think that's quite interesting when it comes to poverty studies too, because something I found as well with Dutt is that he talks more about men, and perhaps it's linked to the idea that men are supposed to provide for the family. And so again, they're to blame if they can't provide for the family, whereas if a woman is poor, it's not her fault, perhaps, just an instinct. But thanks.
Thank you, Maria. About the idea of poverty as self-inflicting, yes, there is sometimes this idea in Leshinsky's writing, because you find the idea that Jewish workers have this air mentality. They are excessively nervous, they can't discipline themselves, and yes, it's because of this airy mentality that they are paupers. Basically, you find in some place this argument, but you also find the opposite argument saying that the air mentality is not synonym with stupidity or lack of spiritual content. But on the contrary, with excessive psychological activity. The main stereotype regarding Jewish psychology at the time was that Jewish workers were excessively agitated. They suffer from nervous disease. They can't discipline to factory work and so forth. So I think this is why the metaphor is interesting, because yeah, you have the idea of a self-inflicting poverty, but at the same time you have the idea that it could be helpful, it could be a resource in modern economic life. And about the idea that maybe it could relate about men are supposed to provide to women. Actually, in the imaginary of Luftmentsh, it was rather the reverse, because some readers, some historians say that in Ashkenazi society, in a traditional Ashkenazi society, the main cultural norms say that it's more important to study religious texts than to provide for the family. And some historians say that because of that, this is a reason why most Luftmentsh, most people without practical means to provide for their family are men, because of this particular role, preeminence of etude or studies over practical means in life. So maybe I can understand to answer to the rest of to the other questions. So I have Aromas. Do you have any example of such statistical storytelling, and what was statistical about it? Yes, as I said, Leshinsky had he was influenced by different travelogues and travelers, statistical travelers, who tried in the 19th century to collect statistics in Russia, mostly in Russia, about Jewish poverty. So I could give you a name. And what was statistics? What was statistical about it? It was statistical because they wanted to collect numbers about incomes, about the size of family budgets, and so forth. And what was storytelling about it? That in these travelogues you find very often figures, statistical tables, and then you have individual portraits of family, of workers, and so forth. So in these travelogues, you have this balance between statistics and verbal description. So then Marcel says, there is a difference between narrative and metaphors. So where would you put your emphasis, narratives or metaphors? Yes, that's true. Strictly speaking, Luftmentsh is a metaphor. It's a metaphor about air. But as I said, it referred very frequently to a typical character of the Yiddish literature. So for instance, you have this character of Menachem Mendel, who could be used as a substantive. For instance, instead of saying there are many Jewish paupers in this city, Leshinsky could say there are many Menachem Mendels. When using this metaphor, it could also relate to a more general literary background, including narratives. So I hope this answered the question. Then we have Jimena Hurtado. Following your hypothesis on gender, what do you think this male metaphor is saying by silencing about poor women or women and poverty? Would this mean they are invisibilized, and if so, why? I would say that in the case of Leshinsky writing, women are, we could say that women are invisibilized because he didn't speak much of women in his analysis of Jewish employment, Jewish social structure, and so forth. He very rarely speaks of women. But maybe as a more general rule, Jewish statisticians studied women employment, of course less than men, but they studied it. But I think they studied it from a completely different perspective. The focus was not on the same ideas. For men, the main challenge was to transform this Luftmentsh to productive workers, to workers in agriculture, in large industry. For women, the focus was completely different. The main matter was to provide education, formation, but there was not all this assumption about excessive psychological activity and so forth. This was only for men, clearly. So then I have a nice comment by Cleo. Thank you. And then Justine Luller, to what extent do you think metaphors add something to metaphor-free literary portraits used in economics? I don't know if they add something. It was just the way he wrote. I don't think you can remove some parts of his discourse. Leshinsky, when he was writing as a journalist or as an academic economist or statisticians, he always used both statistical tables and statistical comments and verbal description. So I couldn't really reply to this question. And also a remark, sorry, I move fast, but we don't have much time left. Also a remark, the metaphor you talk about is already a metaphor in literary text, and then it is transferred to economics, maybe losing some of its metaphorical value. Most metaphors in economic texts become metaphors by being transferred to economics from another domain. In their source domain, they are not metaphors. What does it change? Yes, exactly. This is something we say in the paper. I spoke very quickly, but we say that this case study is very specific because the origin of the metaphor is a metaphor itself. For instance, when Leshinsky says there are too many Menachem Mendels in the city, the origin of the metaphor is not air, is not the element of air. Actually, it's the character of Menachem Mendel in Sholem Menachem's novel, which is already built on metaphor. So yeah, this adds something. This is something we analyze in the paper. And then Julia Marszewski, I would like to ask if you think Yiddish was seen as an adequate language to make science, more specifically economics at the time. I am wondering if Yiddish was not seen as a language more connected to storytelling. Yes, this is a very important question. Thank you. Yiddish was very important in Leshinsky's writing. He was connected to this movement of Yiddishism, the idea that Yiddish should be recognized as a national language for Eastern European Jews. So this was part of a more general agenda. And indeed, Leshinsky tried to write economics in Yiddish so that Yiddish could be also recognized beyond literature as a scientific medium, as a scientific language. But at the same time, what is interesting is that he still his Yiddish is still very popular. In Yiddish, when you want to write something like that looks like very scientific, usually most writers use Germanic forms, many German words. And in Leshinsky's writing, you still find a very popular way of writing Yiddish. So I don't have time to develop on that, but this is a very important part of our article. So that's it. Thank you very much for your many questions. And I think we've finished this session. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you, Nicolas, for sharing.